All right, Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit. We are ending with the beginning. That is, we are ending this overview of the phenomenology of spirit I've been guiding you through on my channel with the preface, which is, of course, the beginning of the book. I am ending with the preface, in part as a recommendation from the author of the foreword of this text I'm reading, J.N. Findley, who suggested to end with the preface. I have seen the wisdom and the logic behind his suggestion, having now followed his advice, in part because the preface was written after the main text of Phenomenology of Spirit. In other words, Hegel wrote the preface after having completed the chapters of the Phenomenology of Spirit, sort of trying to explain himself, trying to explain what is this text you're about to read. And I think that we get an enormous clarity and we get a totally different style of writing in the text, in the preface, than in the main text. Now, before starting, I just want to quickly also mention that if you go to philosophyportal.online, I am leading a course on Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit, which you can take with me. There is information, further information on that website. It starts January 15th, 2022. Let's get into the preface. So Hegel starts the preface with a clear description of really what he is fighting for here, why he wrote this book, where he's taking his philosophical stand. He is specifically fighting against the metaphysics of intuition and feelings of oneness, and he is interested in developing a philosophy capable of articulating the science of the notion and self-becoming. So a few notes on this is that as it relates to the metaphysics of intuition and feeling of oneness, he's talking about this I feel connected to the divine, or I feel one with God, or I feel self-identical with the absolute. For this, Hegel thinks is anti-thinking and anti-philosophical. It rather shuts down thinking, it rather shuts down self-becoming, and is the opposite of what Hegel comes to think of as the real absolute, which is more on the line of not science, but the science of the notion, science of conceptualization. Whether or not science in the 21st century is capable of thinking yet on the Hegelian level, that is the science of the notion and self-becoming, I will leave it to your judgment. But I will say that one who studies Hegel, one who comes to think on the level of the science of the notion and of self-becoming, I think is capable of including themselves and capable of including their own thinking and their own conceptualization in their own process, much better than most thinkers I've encountered today. So the principle that Hegel explores is the absolute as substance and also subject. So the absolute is not just a self-identical substance. The absolute is not just an abyssal subject, it is a relation between substance and subject. And the truth of the reflectivity in the self-relation, what Hegel comes to call negativity, namely because including this dimension into the absolute means that the absolute is always negating itself, always positing itself and overcoming itself and transcending itself. And we'll go a little bit deeper in this preface into how the absolute does this. He then suggests that true philosophical cognition, or absolute cognition, which is the same thing for Hegel, is the temporal notion. Here Hegel is trying to think life and time. And he says that it's the notion that is immersed in the sheer unrest of life. This is to say that conceptualization cannot remain static. Conceptualization cannot remain in a perfect form, self-similar with itself. Conceptualization is something that has to submit to something larger than itself, namely the sheer unrest of life, and find its truth, win its truth in falling apart in this sheer unrest of life. This is a very different way of thinking about identity. This is a very different way of thinking about truth of the concept. And I think it's a very different way of thinking about the way one inhabits philosophy. So, again, Hegel is, in some sense, trying to overcome traditional religious consciousness, or what I'm going to label here pre-Hegelian metaphysics, the one essential being, intuitive identification, with a higher order consciousness, what I'm calling Hegelian metaphysics, where there is a relationship between substance and subject, knowledge and being. And he states from the opening that phenomenology of spirit as an object, what the work is aiming for, is aiming for a real cognition that can get involved with the thing to its limit and negation of identity. Namely, that if you simply posit something as true, but you do not get involved with what you're positing and find out what its limit is, find out what its negativity is, then you're not really engaged with the truth. You have a certain self-knowing, but you don't know what it is in itself. In order to know what it is in itself and its truth, you have to get involved. Again, get involved with the sheer unrest of life and explore what you're positing to its limit. It would have a limit. It's not just going to be unlimited forever. And to its negativity, to its negation, to its opposite of its identity. And this will bring one to an actual knowing of truth in the notion, self-notion. And also for Hegel, this is what scientific consciousness really is. When we think about science, of course, someone like a Charles Darwin comes to mind as perhaps a perfect example. He is someone who really explored his notion. He is someone who really pushed the limits and came to a negativity of his identity in really founding modern theory of biology and life sciences. And he did that by countering, by going against the intuition and the feeling of an edified truth, by going against the feeling and the edification of the truth of the religious scaffolding within which he lived. However, what Hegel is trying to say here is that this same behavior, which Darwin is such a good example of in relationship to his quest in the life sciences, has to be applied to self-consciousness as such. It has to be applied to the notion as such. Namely, that we have to explore the limits of our own identities. We have to explore them to their absolute negativity. Here's a quote, passage number 3. When this activity of aims and results is taken more than the mere beginnings of cognition, when it is allowed to pass for actual cognition, then it should be reckoned as no more than a device for evading the real issue. For the real issue is not exhausted by stating it as an aim, but by carrying it out. Nor is the result the actual whole, but rather the result together with the process through which it came about. The specific difference of a thing is rather its limit. It is where the thing stops, or it is what the thing is not. For in getting involved in the real issue, one must tarry with it, lose oneself in it, and surrender to it. To help bring philosophy closer to the form of science, to the goal where it can lay aside the title love of knowing and be actual knowing, that is what I have set myself to do. If the true exists only in what, or better as what, is sometimes called intuition, sometimes immediate knowledge of the absolute, religion, or being, then what is required in the exposition of philosophy is the form of the notion of the absolute, end quote. So he's starting off this passage by articulating here what I was trying to emphasize in the last slide about taking something to its limit in order to discover its truth. That's merely stating something as an aim, merely stating something as a positing without carrying it through, without finding out what its limit is, where the thing stops. By tarrying with it, losing oneself in it, then it's not true knowledge. True knowledge requires that one lose oneself in it, surrender to it. And that this should be brought to the level of the philosophical notion, namely one's own self-becoming. So to again repeat the example I was giving with Darwin and the life sciences, but then taking that same activity generally to the self itself. And that this is the exposition of philosophy, the form of the notion of the absolute. So he states philosophy must deal with the fact that modern spirit has lost its essential being and is also conscious of this loss, meaning of science for consciousness. So what this means is that spirit, historical spirit, had an essential being, or thought it had an essential being. Not only has this being been lost, we can think about the traditional life, we can think about the ancient way of life, we might even think about the hunter-gatherer way of life. Not only has this essential being been lost, of a subject with its substance in the world, but now consciousness is aware that it's been lost. So this is, again, an example of how Hegel uses the logic of the negation of the negation. Not only has essential being been lost, a negation, but is aware of this loss, negation of negation. And so philosophy must be able to think this. Philosophy must be able to think about basically the lost subject, the reflexive awareness of the lost subject. Quote, if we apprehend a demand of this kind in its broader context and view it as it appears at the stage which self-conscious spirit has presently reached, it is clear that spirit has now got beyond the substantial life it formerly led in the element of thought, that it is beyond the immediacy of faith, beyond the satisfaction and security of the certainty that consciousness then had, of its reconciliation with the essential being, and of that being's universal presence both within and without. It has not only gone beyond all this into the other extreme of an insubstantial reflection of itself into itself, but beyond that too. Spirit has not only lost its essential life, it is also conscious of this loss, and of the finitude that is its own content. Turning away from the empty husks and confessing that it lies in wickedness, it reviles itself for so doing, and now demands from philosophy not so much knowledge of what it is, as the recovery through its agency of that lost sense of solid and substantial being. End quote. So, again, he's talking about how we've lost a substantial life. We've lost certainty in reconciliation with the essential being. In some sense, this is a meditation on the loss of a traditional religious belief. In many ways, this can be thought of as something very similar to Nietzsche's proclamation of the death of God. There is a connection there. But he's also identifying that the subject, in losing this, recognizes its own, what he calls, wickedness, namely that the subject is contending with what it is, and is not so much looking for philosophy, like he's saying here, not so much looking to philosophy to tell it what it is, but is looking for philosophy to recover something, to recover the lost object, to reunify it with something that's been lost. So here, this is where he situates again his project, which is not to recover the subject in the way that the subject wants, which is a reunification with the essential being, but to open the subject up to what is happening and the reality of the modern spirit. He situates the modern spirit on the level of modern science, and he puts the modern spirit on the level of modern science as the differentiation of notion. And this is not just of substance, but also of subject. The subject is going to undergo massive differentiation. I don't think we have fully reconciled or understood our what that means, but the differentiation of notion has continued and continued from Hegel's time to our time. And the metaphysical mystery for Hegel is the idiosyncrasy of the self, not the unity of identity with the absolute, but the idiosyncrasy of the self over a non-conceptual knowing, that this idiosyncrasy of the self is the differentiation of the notion, the differentiation of conceptual knowing. And the dialectician has a responsibility here to the individuals within the historical process. The dialectician has a responsibility to the spirits who are still working their way through their self-notion, through the stages which are described in the Phenomenology of Spirit. He further explains that this birth of modern science, this birth of the spirit of modern science, is the birth of a new era, is a qualitative transformation, is something that's radically different than anything that's come before. And that this modern spirit, this modern world, will dissolve all previous structures and lead us into something unknown, something radically uncertain. And in that unknown, in that uncertainty, we have to understand the science of the notion, that is the idiosyncrasy and the differentiation of the self. Quote, "Truth is notion and necessity as products of that reflection which is at home only in the finite. The power of spirit is only as great as its expression, its depth only as deep as it dares to spread out and lose itself in its exposition, i.e. the idiosyncrasy of the self. Besides, it is not difficult to see that ours is a birth time and a period of transition to a new era. Spirit has broken with the world it has hitherto inhabited and imagined, and it is of a mind to submerge it in the past, and in the labor of its own transformation. Spirit is indeed never at rest, but always engaged in moving forward. From the gradualness of merely quantitative growth, there is a qualitative leap. The spirit in its formation matures slowly and quietly into its new shape, dissolving bit by bit the structure of its previous world, whose tottering state is only hinted at by isolated symptoms. I'll repeat that. Whose tottering state is only hinted at by isolated symptoms. The frivolity and boredom which unsettled the established order, the vague foreboding of something unknown, these are the heralds of approaching change. So he's emphasizing here that you have to be grounded, the truth and the truth of your notion, the truth of your self-notion, and necessity, the idiosyncrasy of your notion, are products of a reflection which are at home only in the finite, meaning that you cannot escape to an eternal absolute for your identity and your truth. You're at home only in the finite, and the power of your spirit is the capacity to spread yourself out and go as deep as possible into this world that we're in. And that we are in a new world. We are in a birthing time. We are in something new. We are still in a birthing time. We are still in something new. Perhaps even stranger, and perhaps something even more bizarre than anything Hegel could have ever dreamed of. But nonetheless, here he's describing how the spirit of modern science is opening up this increasing insanity, this increasing uncertainty, this increasing unknownness. And that the structures that uphold the world of the old are tottering. They're not stable. They produce symptoms. And what do we live in today is a world of massive symptoms, mental symptoms. That the truth of these structures are found in these symptoms. In other words, they're not deviations to be ignored or patched up, or there's some truth in these symptoms themselves, in boredom, in frivolity, in behavior that unsettles the established order. That's where the truth is. And that there's vague forebodings of something unknown coming. Heralds of approaching change. This was true. This is why Hegel's so important for our time. This was true of Hegel's time. And I think this is even more true of our time. So I think this is even more essential that we reflect deeply what Hegel's saying here. And we think it not to identify with Hegel. We think it to think deeply our time. He says, the new world is represented by science as the crown of spirit. He's here a spiritual scientist, or a scientist of spirit. He's not against science, but he's against a science which is not of spirit. And he likens science to a developmental process, and that it has not yet come into its developed notion. That it's an infant child, and could it become full grown? And we can ask ourselves today about science. It was an infant child, but what stage of development is science as a notion? That's the question. What stage is science as a notion? Is it a teenager? Is it a young adult? Is it a fully grown adult? I think that still science is coming into its notion. We can ask ourselves about what will we know about the full developmental historicity of science in 100 years' time and 200 years' time? I think these are questions that are still very much open. I think these are questions that are still very much debated at the foundation of science. So again, to repeat the Hegelian metaphysics, that truth is not only substance, but equally subject. This is a crucial and even axiomatic notion in Hegel. And what he's against is the identity of A equals A, or what he says, all is one. And he actually does use the equation A equals A in the text. Here he is privileging contradiction over identity. He's saying there are no fixed identities. That what's fixed is contradiction. What's fixed is that the one is contradictory with itself. I think that's perhaps the best way that I can express it. And the truth of substance again, it operating here, we're going deeper into the mechanism of how it works. It's a movement. We'll get deeper into the paradoxes of the movement, which I think are essential, especially in contemporary philosophical discussions. It's a movement of self-positing and self-othering. The absolute is something which posits itself and starts othering itself. This is, again, the negativity. So you can see how this is a very different mechanism than the mechanism at work in the traditional metaphysical ideology, which will self-posit to remain self-similar. Hegel here is saying any self-positing to remain self-similar is a defense against truth, a defense against reflection, a defense against becoming other to oneself, a defense against really getting involved with the thing, a defense against really getting involved with life and getting involved with the truth of life, and ultimately the truth of the self-notion. Quote, "Science, the crown of a world of spirit, is not complete in its beginnings. It is the whole which have traversed its contents in time and space, has returned into itself, and is resultant simple notion of the whole. But the actuality of this simple whole consists in those various shapes and forms which have become its moments, and which will now develop and take shape afresh, this time in their new element, in their newly acquired meaning. The formalism of A equals A, where all is one, which recent philosophy denounces and despises, will not vanish from science, till the cognizing of absolute actuality has become entirely clear as to its own nature. In my view, everything turns on grasping and expressing the true, not only as substance, but equally as subject. Further, the living substance is being which is in truth subject, or what is the same, is in truth actual only insofar as it is the movement of positing itself, or is the mediation of its self-othering with itself. Only this self-restoring sameness, or this reflection in otherness with itself, is the true." So he starts by talking about science as a developmental process. He talking about science as something that has come into this world as something new, which is not complete in its beginnings, which is still to reveal what it is, the truth of itself in its notion. I still think that's true to this day. We're still in the development of science. And we are still we still have a huge problem on a social level with the metaphysics of science. And I still think we still have a problem with scientific metaphysicians where they're basically operating on the formalism A equals A, where all is one. And Hegel says here, it will not vanish from science until the cognizing of absolute actuality has become entirely clear as to its own nature. In other words, until we are aware of the nature of spirit, this tendency to A equals A, this tendency to all is one will remain. This privileging of identity over contradiction will remain. This inability to grasp the true as a relation between substance and subject will remain. And this fear and this positing of untruth as truth in order to avoid self-othering will remain. Here, I think what's essential is to recognize that identity and difference are, and this is also forecasting or foreshadowing what becomes in the science of logic, but that this relationship between identity and difference is dialecticized. And you can see here the movement where identity becomes different to itself and then to a self-restoring sameness with this new difference. So the absolute is a process of its own self-becoming, its own work. The absolute becomes what it is through its own, again, self-positing and self-othering. And he says the end, and this is very interesting, that the end of the process is contained at the beginning as a type of seed form. But it only becomes what it is through work. So just because the end is contained as a potential in the beginning, that doesn't mean that that end will be actual. The actuality depends on the work, in the process, in the development of the thing. And the location of the form of cognition required to actualize that seed form is what he calls divine consciousness or God. And it is love with itself based on labor of the negative, this relationship of self-positing, self-othering. The labor of the negative and the qualities of the experience, very important, I think, are seriousness, suffering, and patience. So when you're alone with the alone, when you're laboring in your notion, then for Hegel, the divine consciousness is seriousness, suffering, and patience. To continue this labor of love with itself. This is not a new age form of love, bliss. This is not follow your bliss. This is not you're okay the way you are, or just love yourself for how you are, or some positive affirmation of the absolute. This is a much different type of cognition, a much different type of divinity. And he claims that it is a unity in otherness. It is a unity in alienation. For Hegel, alienation is a positive thing. Negation of negation. Alienation is a positive thing. Unity in otherness, alienation, and then overcoming that alienation. But you never get rid of alienation as such. What happens is that you become at home in the alien. I think that's the best way to say it. You become at home in the alien. And that is pure negativity. Pure otherness of identity. Quote, "The true is the process of its own becoming, the circle that presupposes its end as its goal, having its end also as its beginning, and only by being worked out to its end is it actual. Thus the life of God and divine cognition may well be spoken of as disporting of love with itself. But this idea sinks into mere edification and even insipidity if it lacks the seriousness, the suffering, the patience, and the labor of the negative. In itself, that life is indeed one of untroubled equality and unity with itself, for which otherness and alienation and the overcoming of alienation are not serious matters. The true is the whole, but the whole is nothing other than the essence consummating itself through its development. Of the absolute, it must be said that it is essentially a result, that only in the end is it what it truly is, and that precisely in this consists its nature, viz. To be actual subject, the spontaneous becoming of itself. Whatever is more than such a word, for example, the divine, the absolute, the eternal, contains a becoming other that has to be taken back or is a mediation." End quote. So, to reaffirm many of the things I said in the previous slide, we have here that the subject becomes what it really is by working itself out in a process where the end result is something which was contained at the beginning. That the subject is capable of doing that with a type of self-love, a type of what he calls disporting of love with itself. And again, the qualities of this love are in the seriousness, the suffering, the patience, and the labor of the negative, or the labor of the self-notion. That this is the whole, but this whole is its development. This whole is not a ahistorical, just self-identical absolute. This absolute, this whole is its development and only becomes what it is at the end. So when you think about the historical process in this way, what seed form is contained at the beginning of the historical process itself? What is the historical process developing into? What is the logic of the idea of the human species, of human civilization? These are the types of questions I think that are worth reflecting on from a Hegelian perspective. And that any reference to the divine, the absolute, the eternal, Hegel's saying, he's not saying we cannot say these things, divine, absolute, eternal, but to recognize that these things should be understood as a mediation, that they should include within it subject, that they should include within it reflectivity, that they should include within it the becoming of the truth. Then Hegel takes up the nature of reason and purpose. We often think about these as separate. For Hegel, they're together. Reason as purpose, that the subject makes itself, that the absolute makes itself. Here, the words in itself to for itself are essential, that we usually think about the nature, the true nature of things in themselves. Here, Hegel's identifying a dialectical process where the in itself becomes for itself. So he gives the example of an embryo. I think that this is a really good example because it makes it crystal clear. An embryo is in itself. I was an embryo at one point. You were an embryo at one point. You were a truth in itself. However, Hegel says the adult becomes for itself. I am for myself. I am making this video for myself. You are watching this video, if you're following along and listening up to this point. You are watching and listening this video for yourself, from your perspective, for itself. The in itself becomes for itself. And this is essential for Hegel to understand the absolute, that the absolute is becoming for itself. We can think about the absolute in itself, but the absolute is becoming for itself. Here, he thinks that Aristotle's externalized teleology has discredited purpose, but that does not discredit teleology of purpose in itself becoming for itself. And that one of the crucial dimensions of reconciling and perhaps saving Aristotle's externalized teleology, which I think is becoming more and more something that scientists are entertaining, and there are a few recent books that are wrestling with this, but that there's a self-paradox of rest and unrest to be found in the nature of purpose. And the nature of this self-paradox, I think, is essential. I think that when the self has come to an awareness of itself on the level of the absolute, there's a way in which the self can be in pure rest. But that doesn't mean it doesn't move. And this doesn't mean that it doesn't experience unrest. It's just this perspectival shift on unrest. It's this perspectival shift on alienation and overcoming alienation. And that reaching this level is essential to continue on rationally with the nature of purpose. Again, the purpose is contained at the beginning as unmoved. And it becomes what it is in its actuality through an unfolding, through the moving subject. What many subjects struggle with, I think, is that they, in their unfolding, in their moving, they lose touch with rest. They lose touch with being unmoved. And I think that is especially important for adults who are looking for themselves, adults who are searching for for their core, so to speak. It's in this self-paradox of unmoved and moved. There's probably a lot that can be done here thinking about paradoxes of prime mover, of the unmoved mover, which are usually externalized into God, which are usually externalized away from the self. And I think here Hegel is bringing Aristotle to the level of the self, bringing Aristotle to the level of the historicity of subject and substance. Let's go deeper into it. Reason is misunderstood when reflection is excluded from the true and is not grasped as a positive movement of the absolute. It is reflection that makes the true a result. Though the embryo is indeed in itself a human being, it is not so for itself. That it only is as cultivated reason, which has made itself into what it is in itself. And that is, it, for the first time, is actual. What has just been said can also be expressed by saying that reason is purposive activity. The exaltation of a supposed nature over a misconceived thinking, and especially the rejection of external teleology, has brought the form of purpose in general into discredit. Still, in the sense in which Aristotle, too, defines nature as purposive activity, purpose is what is immediate and at rest, the unmoved which is also self-moving, and as such is subject. The realized purpose, or the existent actuality, is movement and unfolded becoming. But it is just this unrest that is the self. And the self is like that immediacy of simplicity, of the beginning, because it is the result, that which has returned into itself, the latter being similarly just the self. End quote. So here, what Hegel's saying is again using the example of the embryo, using the example of the absolute as something which is in itself and becomes for itself. He is again talking about the the simultaneity of reason and purpose. He is talking about the way in which thinking about reason and purpose together has become discredited, mainly in the scientific universe, where there's a huge flip in between Aristotle's metaphysics and Newtonian metaphysics. Here Hegel is trying to work through this dialectically, the dissimilarity between Aristotelian and Newtonian metaphysics, and bringing it to the level of subject, bringing it to the level of the historicity, the science of the notion. And here identifying this paradox of rest and movement, and bringing it again to the level of the self. So he then talks about the ancients and the moderns. And this is, I think, connected to him and his dialectical relationship between Aristotle and modern science, let's say. He identifies that the ancients represented the absolute as a substance, but that the moderns cannot still remain within this representation of the absolute, and that is why we're losing touch with the absolute. Because for moderns, we need to also represent the absolute as subject. We need to also include ourselves within the absolute. The absolute becomes self-reflexive, and this seems to be a qualitative transition in the absolute for Hegel, which you can learn a lot more about in a lot greater detail if you study the chapter on absolute knowledge. In the chapter on absolute knowledge, Hegel goes through the history of the absolute becoming reflexive. He starts with Descartes. He works through Leibniz. He works through the utilitarians. He works through the Enlightenment thinkers. He works through Kant. He works through Fichte. He works through Schelling. And he sees this as the process of the absolute becoming reflexive, the absolute becoming more aware of itself, more aware of the need to include subject within the substance. The paradox is that absolute subjective standpoints, fixing substance, make the actuality of the absolute impossible as self-movement. So when a subject identifies with substance as absolute, they fix it. And what they're doing is that they're fixing something outside of themselves, which they need to include within themselves. This is, I think, so important. He then says the paradox is resolved in absolute spirit as alone the actuality that is in and for itself and determining other being. So the fixed point of substance outside of the subject needs to be made fluid, needs to be dissolved, because it makes self-movement impossible. This is again overcoming A equals A. This is again instituting a metaphysics of contradiction, of an absolute which is becoming other for itself, determining itself as other. Quote, the need to represent the absolute as a subject has found expression in the propositions God is the eternal, the moral world order, love, and so on. In such propositions, what is posited is not a being, something that merely is, but rather something that is reflected into itself, a subject. The subject is assumed as a fixed point to which, as their support, the predicates are affixed by a movement belonging to the knower of this subject. After this point has been presupposed, the nature of the movement cannot really be other than what it is. Hence, the mere anticipation that the absolute is subject is not only not the actuality of this notion, but it even makes the actuality impossible. That the true is actual is expressed in the representation of the absolute as spirit, the most sublime notion, and the one which belongs to the modern age and its religion. The spiritual alone is the actual. It is that which relates itself to itself and is determinate. It is other being and being for itself. In other words, it is in and for itself. The spirit that so developed knows itself as spirit is science. Science is its actuality in the realm which it builds for itself in its own element. End quote. So here he's saying again that when the subject fixes a substance outside of itself, God is the eternal, the moral world order, love, and so on. Says such propositions are not properly reflected back into themselves as subject. Basically, the subject is fixing predicates outside of itself, using them as a support, using them as a crutch. But the absolute as subject, the absolute as subject that is connected to the truth as it's becoming, is the absolute as spirit itself, which he calls the most sublime notion. And he says which belongs to the modern age and its religion. So he does say that the modern age will have its religion. And this is important to know because religion is an important stage of the absolute in the phenomenology of spirit. But ultimately, spirit has to know itself as science and is science. So this is very different than modern science. It's again a spirit science. And this science is a science which builds itself for itself. It's a science for itself, and it builds itself in its own element. This has to do with the idiosyncrasy of the differentiation of the self-notion in becoming. On this level, what we're dealing with here is pure self-recognition and absolute otherness, what Hegel calls ether. He says this is the ground and soil of science or knowledge in general. So I think what the greatest scientists have, what the greatest scientists in the history of the modern world have, is a pure self-recognition and absolute otherness. But science as an institution, science as historical institution, is not built by subjects of this nature. Subjects of this nature are usually outside of these institutions. Subjects of these nature are usually, they're in otherness, like a Darwin. There are many others. I always name subjects like Einstein, also subjects like Marx, subjects like Nietzsche. They are really in their own absolute otherness, their own ether. And this is the ground or soil of science, and this needs to be brought to the level of subjectivity itself. Spirit must raise itself to this ether to be able to live with and in science. An individual must achieve this standpoint. In other words, it's not just enough to know science. It's not just enough to know the scientific method. That method needs to be applied to spirit in such a way as that it can raise itself to this level of pure self-recognition and absolute otherness. Then spirit can truly live in and with science, because it can become a spirit science. It can become a science of spirit. It says the individual is the absolute form and is an immediate certainty. It says science must unite itself with self-certainty to become itself. Now, Hegel here is not... First, what Hegel's trying to do is unite the spirit with science, and the individual form of spirit. But when he talks about self-certainty, he is not talking about a self-certainty in the sense of Descartes' I think, therefore I am. It is more a self-certainty which is capable of engaging in this positing and self-othering, and is certain of itself in this context, is certain with itself in uncertainty. Quote, pure self-recognition and absolute otherness, this aether as such, is the ground and soil of science or knowledge in general. This simple being in its existential form is the soil of science. It is thinking which has its being in spirit alone. Science on its part requires that self-consciousness should have raised itself into this aether in order to be able to live with science and in science. Conversely, the individual has the right to demand that science should at least provide him with the ladder to this standpoint, should show him this standpoint within himself. Let science be in its own self what it may. Relatively to immediate self-consciousness, it presents itself in an inverted posture. Or because this self-consciousness has the principle of its actual existence in the certainty of itself, science appears to it not to be actual, since self-consciousness exists on its own account outside of science. Science must therefore unite this element of self-certainty with itself. So here, again, to reiterate, Hegel is saying that eventually spirit recognizes a pure self-recognition and absolute otherness, which is an aether, and is the ground. And he's articulating an existential form of science. He is articulating the way in which science cannot just be decoupled from spirit, or science does not function decoupled from spirit. That the greatest scientists were the greatest spirits. Science is made possible by great spirit, which is not looking for recognition from an other, which is not looking for recognition from another historical human being. This is so important. Moreover, he's making a social claim inversely that society should be providing spirit. If society is a scientific society, society should be providing spirit the opportunity to reach this standpoint within himself or herself. And that if society doesn't do this, that the spirit will have, he says, an inverted posture and will do damage to itself. Because it's like giving a child a gun. It's giving a spirit that doesn't know itself a very powerful method, a very powerful tool, and not giving it understanding of itself. Very important. He says this is the point of the phenomenology of spirit, the coming to be of science, from sense immediacy to religion, the enormous labor of the negative. In phenomenology of spirit, we go from consciousness, self-consciousness, reason, spirit, religion, absolute knowledge. This is the enormous labor of the negative, the coming to be of science. And that the problem is oftentimes that science does not take into consideration this coming to be of the spirit inside of science itself. He says this coming to be, this phenomenology of spirit, is different than a foundation of science. It is the individual's formative stages of universal spirit. It is the way the individual comes to be the subject of absolute knowledge. He says that we do a lot of damage by not understanding the most familiar things, not understanding what is sense. To go on the level of consciousness, we have sense, perception, understanding. What is sense? What is perception? What is understanding? On the level of the ego, on the level of self-consciousness, what is recognition? What does recognition mean for me? How does recognition mediate me? How does recognition affect my life? What is nature? He's saying the very familiar must be understood cognitively. That often we forget the process of coming to be great spirit. Quote, "It is this coming to be of science as such or of knowledge that is described in this phenomenology of spirit. Knowledge in its first phase is sense consciousness. To beget the element of science, which is the pure notion of science itself, it must travel a long way and work its passage. This process of coming to be will not be an initiation of the unscientific consciousness into science, nor the foundation of science, least of all will it begin straight away with absolute knowledge. The goal is spirit's insight into what knowing is. Impatience demands the impossible and the attainment of the end without the means. Since the substance of the individual has had the patience to take upon itself the enormous labor of world history, the individual certainly cannot, by the nature of the case, comprehend his own substance more easily. Quite generally, the familiar, just because it is familiar, is not cognitively understood, and the commonest way in which we deceive ourselves or others about understanding." End quote. He's saying that the point of the phenomenology of spirit is this coming to be of science, and that we often forget the very coming to be of the spirit. And I think that it's very true still of our culture, and it's very important that our culture reinstantiate a coming to be. A coming to be what we could potentially become. To understand the familiar, to understand how we come to be the greatest possible spirits we can be. Unless we know what knowing is, there's often too much certain knowing without knowing what knowing is. And this is what phenomenology of spirit helps to address. And also to refamiliarize ourselves with the familiar. To take a long time to actually dwell in, to think about the most familiar things. Sense, perception, understanding. Oftentimes we overlook these things. We might be interested in some very complex object, some very complex process disconnected from ourselves, without really understanding what is sense, what is perception, what is understanding. And he says we deceive ourselves in this way. On the level of active universality, he talks about the faculty of the understanding as the absolute power. That it was the absolute power in the activity of dissolution, not in the activity of holding together or reification, but in dissolution. He says it's the most astonishing and mightiest of powers. He says that an accident detached from self-enclosed circling gaining a separate freedom is the power of the negative or the pure I. So you can think about this self-enclosed circle with no room for difference, with no room for otherness, with reifying itself, not destroying itself from within. It says the power of the negative is the ability to break apart. It's like a circle with a gap in it. The pure I is there. He also puts the location of death there as the ultimate non-actuality and the key to actual spiritual power. The truth of self is found in its utter dismemberment, saying it's magic. Here, we're going to be confronting some of the most important passages in the preface, in my view, which is getting at the very core of the thing, which is getting at the very core of absolute knowledge. Passage 32. The activity of dissolution is the power and work of the understanding, the most astonishing and mightiest of powers, or rather the absolute power. The circle that remains self-enclosed and like substance holds its moments together, has nothing astonishing about it, but that an accident as such, detached from what it circumscribes it, should attain freedom. This is the tremendous power of the negative. It is the energy of thought of the pure I. Death. This non-actuality is of all things the most dreadful, and to hold fast what is dead requires the greatest strength. The life of spirit is not the life that shrinks from death, untouched by devastation, but rather the life that endures it and maintains itself in it. It wins its truth only when in utter dismemberment it finds itself. Spirit is the power only by looking the negative in the face and tarrying with it. This tarrying with the negative is the magical power that converts it into being. This power is identical with the subject, giving determinateness and existence in its own element, and thus supersedes abstract immediacy. So some of the lines on this page here are some of the most powerful in the preface. It again talks about how this self-enclosed circle is nothing astonishing. That this self-enclosed circle is frightened of death. This self-enclosed circle is not finding its truth precisely because it is protecting itself from the truth. And then it should attain its freedom requires that it go into the tremendous power of the negative, what he calls the energy of thought and the pure I. He locates this also with death as a non-actuality. We have to think non-actuality within actuality. He says the life of spirit is not shrinking from death, but going into death, and finds itself in this destruction. I think there's a lot to be found in these passages, and a lot to be found in the sort of secret to Hegel's thinking in these passages, because it's what he's describing here, the basic circle which is closed in on itself, and the gap in the circle where you find the truth and fall apart and rebuild your circle. This is the motor by which I think the Phenomenology of Spirit is written. It says, the active universal put itself to the test at every point of its existence, philosophizing about everything it came across. So the very process of coming to be through sense, through self-consciousness, through reason, spirit, religion, it's the individual that's tested itself at every point along the way, has become truth through this process, has become the pure I through this process. And he says is purged of both the sensuous immediacy of its origin and the fixed abstract thoughts of formative education. So it's become through its contingent origin and sense immediacy, but it's purged itself of this sense immediacy of its origin. And it's also purged itself of all the fixed abstract thoughts of its formative education. Both were necessary, but both are purged in the end of the pure I at the stage of absolute knowledge. And what is found is a truthful self-motion as pure circles. Pure circles here, I guess, are circles that are not self-enclosed circles, but circles that include otherness. And he says, this is scientific method for immediate existence. This is science of consciousness. Totally always in touch with the self. Putting itself to the test at every point of its existence and philosophizing about everything it came across, it made itself into a universality that was active through and through. The task used to consist mostly in purging the individual out of an immediate sense mode of apprehension and making him into a substance that is an object of thought and that thinks. But now the opposite, in freeing determinate thoughts from their fixity, so as to give actuality to the universal, and to impart to it spiritual life. By giving up not only the fixity of the pure concrete, which the I itself is, in contrast with its differentiated content, but also the fixity of the differentiated moments which, posited in the element of pure thinking, share the unconditioned nature of the I. Through this movement, the pure thoughts become notions, and are only now what they are in truth, self-movements, circles, spiritual essences, which is what their substance is. This movement of pure essences constitutes the nature of scientific method in general. So here Hegel's really pushing towards really what is a science of consciousness, a science of existence, a science connected to spirit. And it's really about overcoming fixed categories and being in constant relation to the existence of your immediate being. Becoming pure thinking. Self-movements, circles, spiritual essences, which is what their substance is. It's spirit in itself. It's instead of doing what Darwin did to life, it's spirit doing this to itself. So he says, science of experience, a substance movement as object of consciousness, becoming other to self and superseding otherness. This is the mechanism we've gone over, and he's repeating it again. And I think this is the mechanism. It's very clear. This is the mechanism. You take yourself as an object. You posit yourself. You become other to yourself. You supersede this otherness. And that this never goes away, that absolute knowledge is basically becoming aware of this gap between the I and the substance, or between the self and the substance. That the gap itself, and I think that you can become, in some sense, I think it's possible to become the gap itself, or to become the disparity itself. And when you become the disparity itself between the I and the substance, that's when there's a perspective shift on alienation. That's when you become at home in alienation. And that's when you become the void, or the soul of the self, the soul in the self itself. And he says this is the conclusion of the phenomenology of spirit, where substance shows itself as subject and spirit wins itself. So these distinctions are crucial. You win yourself in the loss of substance. You win yourself in the falling apart of substance. And that's the conclusion of the phenomenology of spirit. You become the cut between substance and subject. Quote, the immediate existence of spirit, consciousness, contains the two moments of knowing and the objectivity negative to knowing. The science of this pathway is the science of the experience which consciousness goes through. The substance and its movement are viewed as the object of consciousness. But spirit becomes object because it is just this movement of becoming an other to itself, becoming an object to itself, and of superseding this otherness. The disparity which exists in consciousness between the I and the substance, which is its object, is the distinction between them, the negative in general. This can be regarded as the defect of both, though it is their soul, or that which moves them. That is why some of the ancients conceived the void as the principle of motion, for they rightly saw the moving principle as the negative, though they did not yet grasp that the negative is the self. When it has shown this completely, spirit has made its existence identical with its essence. With this, phenomenology of spirit is concluded. And here, although the preface is not concluded, this is where I'm going to end part 1 of my coverage of the preface. Because it's an essential moment to reflect on, I think, one of the most important statements in all of philosophy. Namely, that Hegel's here saying that the absolute was conceived by ancients in a way that included movement and a relationship to the void. However, although this principle of movement was identified, the ancients did not understand that this was connected to the key to the self. So again, if the ancients had ultimately a reified view of the absolute as substance and a self-identical view of the absolute as substance, what they did not grasp was the principle of the subject. That is what's becoming clearer as time goes on. The location of the subject in the absolute. The relation of that subject to the void. The key to understanding movement itself. Why am I moving? And I think ultimately, with absolute knowledge, that the subject becomes this void itself. Becomes this disparity, becomes this cut, becomes this hole between subject and substance. And in there, you have the key to the whole mechanism of positing and becoming other. And here also why concluding the first overview of the preface here is that in this section of the preface, Hegel is concluding the point of the phenomenology of spirit. With this, the phenomenology of spirit is concluded. And with this, we have the level at which the subject must be brought in order to properly work with science, in order to properly be a scientific subject. And I think with that, we have the right to analyze our current world, to analyze our current relationship to science, to analyze our current relationship to society as something that needs to be rethought much deeper along the lines of what Hegel's describing in the phenomenology of spirit. That if we have a scientific society, if we're dwelling in a scientific age, the individual has the right to be brought to the standpoint of knowing. The individual has the right to be brought to the standpoint of absolute knowledge in order to then really work with what it is. Only then will we be able to approach real problems of sexuality, of economics, of politics. You can see why post-Hegelian philosophy started to wrestle with Marxism. You can see why post-Hegelian philosophy wrestled with phenomenology, with existentialism, with psychoanalysis, with various disciplines within continental philosophy. And why the phenomenology of spirit is such an important text to this day, so foundational, perhaps not understood properly to this day, not properly embedded, not properly thought. So I leave you there, and I will pick up in the second part of the preface to the phenomenology of spirit.